Welcome to Risky Bitness. Before I get started, I would like to quickly thank everyone for their supportive and encouraging comments. I was really ready to quit YouTube altogether, but I discovered that a lot of people really enjoy my content and see it as something of value. Because of this, I've decided to continue the channel. I'll still do these scripted videos, just not quite as often, and between the scripted videos, I'll be doing long plays and probably streaming from time to time. Now, let's get started. The Super Nintendo was an absolute RPG powerhouse, but Western audiences only saw a fraction of the tremendous library that was available. Thanks to the tireless work of independent translators, we now have access to a great number of games that were never released in the West. When I began playing around with emulators, one game that mystified me was Lodoss Senki, or Record of Lodoss War. Back in the day, there was this partial translation floating around that was incredibly buggy, and definitely nowhere near finished at all. But the introduction looked really cool, and I'd heard of the anime series, but at the time I hadn't seen it. The visuals and classic fantasy style were definitely right up my alley. I gave up on ever experiencing this game because of the unfinished translation. Luckily, today there is a complete translation by Dynamic Designs. A link to the patch can be found in this video's description. While looking up information to make this video, I learned that Record of Lodoss War is a huge franchise by itself, but not as a video game series. The story of Lodoss actually began as a series of transcripts of tabletop gaming sessions. There's a word for this or phrase for this. Remind me what it was in the comments. Ryu Mizuno and his group would transcribe their campaigns in various tabletop games, including Dungeons & Dragons, which took place in Mizuno's own world called Fossilia. This allowed the group the freedom to combine rules from different games. It was interesting to learn about this, as I was not aware that tabletop RPGs had a following in Japan in the 80s, though it certainly does explain quite a lot of the RPG legacy. It is truly fascinating that the distinct Japanese RPG style was born from a hybrid of Western tabletop games and Japanese manga. If you look at the early NES games, it kind of does make sense, like Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest. They definitely have a very, very Dungeons & Dragons feel. Over time, these sessions grew into a world of their own, spawning a series of novels about the cursed island of Lodoss, broken off from the main continent, and its war against the Demon King. From there, it was adapted into several manga series and anime series, and of course a handful of video games. Lodoss is considered hugely influential to the world of JRPGs and fantasy anime. The lore of Lodoss is deep and expansive, and it's much bigger than what I can cover here in this video. I definitely recommend looking elsewhere for an in-depth coverage of the Lodoss universe as a whole. For this video, I'm going to be focused on the Super Famicom game that was never released in the US, and I'll leave the deep lore to the experts. I will be touching on the lore a little bit because it is part of the game. Now, there are other Lodoss games. If you'd be interested in watching me do a retrospective on those other Lodoss games, let me know in the comments. I'll definitely check them out. As you might be able to glean from the source material, Lodoss is based on common high fantasy swords and sorcery tropes. Again, I won't go in depth because this could be a series of videos all on its own. I actually studied fantasy literature in college, and it is a passion of mine. But it all goes back to Tolkien and the staples of the genre he created. Elves, dwarves, and goblins populate a world of magic and wonder, firmly rooted in that medieval Europe aesthetic. Record of Lodoss War is a turn-based strategy RPG with 4 gameplay types. Overworld exploration, in which the player walks around the world map. Visiting towns and dungeons to gather information and purchase items, as was typical of the genre at the time. Dungeon exploration, and grid-based battles. The Overworld Travel is par for the course with JRPGs. However, the travel is incredibly limited. You can only travel by foot and only visit small parts of the game at a time. Areas are generally locked until you progress the story enough to gain access to them. There is a world map, but it doesn't show your current location and you can't zoom or pan, so it's totally useless. I checked it a few times while I was playing and I had absolutely no idea where I was. The landmarks the map gives you don't look like anything near anywhere in the actual game world. You'll get into random battles on the world map and you can do a little bit of grinding there. Luckily, Lodoss is pretty generous with XP and gold, so you don't have to do much grinding. The game feels to be played quickly. NPCs in towns are actually quite helpful and they do an excellent job of pointing the player in the right direction. Shops don't have item descriptions, but will tell you who can equip the weapon or armor, and if it's better than what he or she currently has equipped, although it won't tell you by how much. You can only save your game at an inn, so doing this whenever you visit a town is absolutely crucial. Instead of waiting for the player to figure the right sequence of events, many story events that occur in towns can be repeated as many times as you need until you get them right. Where this game really stands out are its grid battles and dungeons. We'll talk about dungeons first. Dungeons are really large and maze-like in this game. It's easy to get lost. If you want to view a dungeon map, you have to use a Stone of Sight, which you can purchase in towns. It only allows you to view the map one time per use, so if you run out of stones while you're in the dungeon, you are out of luck. Unlike world and town exploration, dungeons shift the perspective to a 3/4 view, and moving around them requires using diagonal controls only. It's a little gimmicky and it takes some getting used to. It was downright frustrating at first. The rate of random encounters in dungeons is also very high, which further confounds that maze aspect. It's very easy to get turned around and you're constantly battling monsters all the time. As expected, you must always be well prepared with potions and healing items before entering a dungeon. Dungeons are sealed until you have progressed the story enough to enter them. Another side note about this is that you will not find any maps, FAQs, or walkthroughs for this game online. They do not exist, so you could definitely want to use those Stones of Sight and maybe draw a map while you're doing that. And if you do that, please upload the maps for other players. Now to the meat of the game, the battles. I haven't seen anything quite like this on the SNES. The turn-based battles are fought on a grid that's usually 3x3, but can change depending on the fight. It feels a lot like a game board where a character can move one square to the left, right, forward, or back, and then choose an action. The characters on the board look like miniatures, and the board has a chess motif, all paying respect to the game's tabletop roots. A special accessory can increase your movement range. You can use a combination of melee and ranged attacks and magic to defeat your foes. You can also attack on diagonals if you equip a spear. Lodoss doesn't make you schlep through hours and hours of being weak and useless either. You get a pretty impressive array of spells very early in the game, and your characters get to a high level almost immediately. This is necessary for the flow of the game, which I'll discuss in greater detail shortly. Unfortunately, these battles don't feel particularly deep. While a lot of times I was challenged with even regular enemies just because of the positioning aspect of the battles, the bosses didn't have any kind of special strategy that was required to defeat them. They just had a lot more HP than everybody else. So it's kind of a bummer when you're playing a strategy RPG and you find that there's not really all that much strategy involved. It's cool that positional awareness is important, but when the positional awareness plays out the same way in all the fights, it's not really that impressive. Plus, the strongest enemies in the game are dragons that don't move at all, and they take up half the game board, so your characters can't move either. It's kind of a lot of wasted potential, I think. There are a few quirks to these battles though that make them feel unique. You can escape the battle by moving a player piece off the board, and you can also win the battle quickly by defeating the enemy leader unit. It's a lot like capturing the king in a game of chess. The leader will be revealed when he's attacked. A crown will appear over the leader's head. You can defeat the leader by depleting its life points, which is standing in for HP in this game, or by using multiple melee attacks to knock it off the board. Melee attacks often push enemies back a square and can even push one enemy into another, which has a domino effect. Knocking the enemy leader off the board results in a checkmate, which will double the experience points gained. As the game progresses, enemy units will work harder and harder to stand between you and their leader, so toward the end of the game, the AI does get a little bit smarter and tries to keep you away from the leader. In the beginning, you can just kind of walk up to the leader and just sock him. There are no spell details in battles, so you'll probably want a guide to help you figure out what all your spells and skills do. I think there's only one published FAQ on this game on the internet right now, and it's not very good. And in fact, it's not based on the translated version, it's based on the person who wrote the guide translating it while writing the guide for himself. So there's not a lot of help to be had on this one. The game's not terribly challenging, and starting you off with powerful characters comes back to the lore. The game is super story-driven, there's lots of long cutscenes with exposition and dialogue. There's a lot of reading in this game for sure. It plays out in 4 different scenarios, and each one is focused on one of the 6 heroes who defeated the Demon King in the introduction to the game, and it explains the events leading up to the titular Lodoss War. The first scenario follows the Grey Witch Carla, who is suffering from amnesia after the battle. She can possess the bodies of her enemies. The next scenario revolves around Beld, who has taken up the sword of the Demon King to defeat him, but now lives with its curse. It damages his body and his mind. The third scenario follows Fawn, a holy knight of Valus, and his friend Theseus. Fawn fought alongside Beld and Carla to defeat the Demon King. With the king dying of a mysterious illness, Fawn soon uncovers a sinister plot to take over the kingdom of Valus. The final and longest scenario takes place 30 years later, and it follows Parn, the hero of the anime series, who is the son of Theseus, Fawn's companion. The other scenarios are all very brief and can be completed in about 2 or 3 hours. Parn's story is really the meat and potatoes of the game, and it could be argued that Chapter 4 is where the game begins, after all the backstory has been established. It's the first time you start out with level 1 characters and experience a full adventure, with the prior 6 hours of gameplay really just being exposition. This is where the other characters, Beld, Carla, and Fawn, start their war for control of Lodoss, along with the other heroes from the beginning of the game, who have their roles in the larger story as well. During Parn's story, all of the character arcs that were established previously are completed. This is where the eponymous Lodoss War occurs, and the events of the game follow the beginning of that war. Because I've never been a big fan of the Lodoss series, a lot of this was kind of lost on me. I tried watching the anime, but I just really couldn't get into it. From what I gather, the story appears to take place just before the events in the OVA, but there seems to be some overlap. There are some events in the game that did seem really similar to what happened in the first episode of the anime. Not quite the same, but very similar. Toward the end, it seems like they must have run out of time or budget, because the last area you visit has no world map to explore at all. Suddenly you simply select a destination each time you approach the gate or the castle, and the exploration of the desert part takes place outside the player's control. The NPC hints also get really vague, or they just stop altogether. All the characters in each scenario follow common fantasy archetypes: warriors, clerics, wizards, and thieves. Most are human, there are a couple of elves, and of course there is one dwarf, the fan favorite Deedlit. Graphically, I'm going to leave that in. Graphically, this game looks really great for an SNES game. Coming out late in the life of the console, it has graphics reminiscent of Final Fantasy VI, but with these really cool anime-style character portraits during dialogue sections. The walking animation feels much more heavy and deliberate, and it's kind of cool how the characters kind of bounce up and down the stairs. I apologize for the earlier flubs in the narration. When I have a long script like this, sometimes that happens, and I'm not gonna cut it, I'm just gonna leave it in. I feel like it's nice when you hear somebody just speaking naturally. The music is really excellent, and it's a true hidden gem of the system. I would say this game is worth a playthrough for the music alone. You can hear it in the background of the video. The translation used for this video is really fantastic, and I'm very grateful to the folks at Dynamic Designs for all the hard work they put into it. Because of them, I was finally able to play this game. Unfortunately, it's just an okay game. I'm glad I was able to try it out, but it's kind of boring. If you're a huge fan of the larger Lodoss universe, I think it's a must-play for you. Otherwise, you can skip it. It's an interesting footnote in the history of JRPGs, and the genre of high fantasy on the whole. It's a curious part of the Lodoss legacy, but on a console that is bursting at its seams with great RPGs, nobody will blame me for skipping this one. I didn't wind up finishing it because I got bored. Still, the influence that Lodoss has on today's fantasy can't be denied, so it's interesting to have experienced this. I think this is a game that would have been really amazing if it were released for the cancelled CD-ROM add-on. They could have added footage from the anime series, voice acting, CD audio. It would have really improved the way the story is being presented. That's all. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe and enable notifications so you don't miss my next RPG video. I also cover other types of classic games from all genres, including legendary franchises like Final Fantasy and Castlevania, as well as some more obscure titles or games that never left Japan. If that sounds like something you'd be interested in, be sure to come by again. If you would like to support the channel, please use the affiliate links below. If you have anything to add, please sound off in the comments. I look forward to hearing from you. If there's any particular game you would like to see me cover, or any question about a game that you would like to see me answer in one of my videos, absolutely let me know. What I like to do with these videos is I like to come up with a question, and then in the video I try to answer that question. So see some of the other videos on the channel. Is ActRaiser 2 the hardest game on the SNES? Or is Final Fantasy XIII really that bad? I like to ask questions and try my best to answer them, so if you have a question you'd like to see me answer, let me know in the comments. For the RPG videos, I'm mostly doing retrospectives, but if there's a question that you would like me to look into in one of those RPG retrospectives, let me know. Thanks once again for watching, and until next time, game over.